15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 10, 9. Ignition sequence start.
Space Nuts.
5, 4, 3, 2.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Space Nuts.
Astronauts report it feels good.
Hello again and Happy New Year. Welcome to Space Nuts, the astronomy podcast with me, your host, Andrew Dunkley, and astronomer at large, Fred Watson. Hi, Fred. Happy New Year.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Happy New Year to you too. And I hope your festive season went well and was peaceful and happy and has brought you rejuvenated back to the microphone for another year.
No,
Space Nuts.
Didn't do that.
No, didn't do that. Okay, all right. Oh,
no, it's very nice, very quiet. Just a quiet one with some of the family. My eldest and youngest couldn't get home because they got new jobs and couldn't get time off, so they got stuck in Sydney. But we'll catch up with them in the next couple of weeks, so that'll be nice. But yeah, it was a lovely festive season, although very, very hot, which I'm sure those in the Northern Hemisphere are going, I couldn't imagine Christmas in the heat, but that's normal for us. And we had temperatures well into the high 30s, low 40s, so those are pretty nasty temperatures, which is well over 100 degrees in Fahrenheit for those of you that live on the wrong side of the planet. Now, coming up today, Fred, Ultima Thule, the flyby by the New Horizons probe, which visited Pluto a while back, which you and I have discussed a couple of times. They've now done the flyby of this nugget in space. And we'll have to see what they did see. We're also going to look at Chang'e 4, the Chinese moonshot mission, and a quirky little story, but one that is probably of interest to many people because this just happens to make the news. They made lots of movies about it, TV series, documentaries about alien abductions, but apparently the incidence of them has fallen, which is interesting, or, you know, whatever they are. But let's first look at Ultima Thule, the flyby of the potato rock, or whatever you want to call it, way past Pluto. How did that go?
But apparently very well. So, yes, the flyby was on the 1st of January, a really cracking start to 2019.
Yes.
It was on the 14th of July 2015 that New Horizons flew by Pluto. It seems to have gone very quickly the time since then. You probably remember, and we've certainly spoken about this before on Space Nuts, that in the aftermath of the Pluto encounter, the spacecraft was in such good shape, all systems going, lots of fuel for its, from its little nuclear generator, everything looking really good. That was when the decision was taken to target another Kuiper belt object. This is the belt of icy asteroids out there beyond Neptune. And in fact, 2014 MU69 was the name of the object that was targeted. That's still its proper name, even though the community now tends to refer to it as Ultima Thule, a very old expression going back to medieval times for the most distant thing you can imagine. It's a very nice double-barreled name for what has turned out to be a double-barreled object. Actually,
yes, that's right. As we've discussed before, some of these things fuse together or gravitate together, whatever you want to call it, and that does definitely appear to be what this is.
That's right. So on the approach, we started getting signals back before the close encounter, just things that showed that this was, in fact, the shape. People thought at first the shape of a bowling pin. And there was an epic moment in the mission control. The principal investigator, a man called Alan Stern, who I've met, is a great guy. He put this picture up and said, "You're allowed to laugh." But then very soon afterwards, of course, the encounter took place at a distance of 3,500 kilometers. What's that? It's about 2,000 miles from Ultima Thule, showing this clear double-barreled object. In fact, it's being likened to a snowman because It's got a more or less spherical body and a more or less spherical head, which is smaller than the body. And the two halves are now being called Ultima and Thule. And if I remember rightly, Ultima's the big one. I might have that the wrong way round.
Okay. Now, initial reports suggested, yes, New Horizons has arrived, and that's all they knew. Have they learned anything about Ultima Thule since then?
Yeah. So the issue now, of course, is bringing the data back, and it's the same problem as faced New Horizons when it flew by Pluto, because the distance is so great, and it's now, I think, something like 1.5 billion kilometers further away than what it was with Pluto. So the data rates are very, very slow. What they did was got a fairly low resolution image back almost immediately. In fact, because New Horizons carries several instruments and they're all working, it's great. I think it's got 7 on board. You can get images at different resolutions and with effectively different sensitivities. So what they did was they got a fairly high resolution image showing certainly some surface features. There are clearly things looking like craters there on the surface, although, as you said, it still does look like a rather wonky potato. But then a much lower resolution image, but with color sensitivity. And that shows quite definitively that Ultima Thule is reddish in color, and that's absolutely typical of these objects out there in the depths of the solar system. There are several of them that are distinctly red. Pluto's moon Charon had a polar region that is very red as well, and the thinking is that this is something that science seems to understand, that what you've got here is the effect of organics on the surface, and that by that I mean carbon-containing compounds. And I think, if I remember rightly, these things are called tholins. I'm not enough of a chemist to know exactly what that means, but I'll certainly find out before we talk again. And these things are their state is modified when they're basically bombarded with cosmic rays and other radiation, and you get this characteristic reddish color. So the people are very happy about that. One thing, well, let me just fill in the detail. At the moment, this sounds crazy, but Ultima Thule and New Horizons too, but both of them are effectively, from this distance, they're in the same place, even though New Horizons is now well past Ultima Thule. They're behind the sun seen from our vantage point on the Earth. So there is going to be a break until mid-January, a break in transmission. So we won't receive any data while the sun's in the way, which is a good idea, because you won't get anything. It'll just disappear into the wilds of the universe. So once the alignment with the sun is broken as the spacecraft continues its journey, and more especially the Earth continues its own journey around the sun, then we'll get this direct line of sight, and the data download will start in earnest. It's going to take, they estimate, something like 20 months to get everything back. So we'll still be talking about this.
That's just mind-blowing, the amount of data. But I think I read somewhere that in terms of its capacity to store data, it's a very impressive machine, but in terms of downloading it, it's about as fast as a dial-up system, which is part of the reason why it takes so long. Yeah. Which is still more effective than the Australian internet system at the moment, but that's another story. But the other thing that blew my mind is I just read that New Horizons has been doing this journey for 13 years now.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, it was just short of 10 years when I think it was launched in 2006.
Yeah.
So
we're coming up on the anniversary, January 19.
That's right. It was it the 19th? Is that?
That's what it says in this report.
I think it was the 19th. Yeah. It's the date I have in my memory. Yeah. So just to kind of dot the I's and cross the T's. Yes, you're right. It's two separate objects that have come together. What's called the contact binary. That was the same with the comet that we spoke about over the last few years, Churyumov of Gerasimenko, which was shaped like a rubber duck. The gravitational data on that showed that it actually was two objects that were stuck together. And this seems to be a pretty common occurrence out there. And in many ways, it's good that we find this, because it sort of reinforces our our basic theories of planet formation, which says that things start off like this. You get lumps sticking together.
And and I'd imagine in the Kuiper Belt things clatter into each other, or would have clattered into each other quite regularly.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So there's the interesting thing is there is a bright band of material around the sort of neck where these two lumps join together, which is thought to be fresh material that's sort of found its way onto that link, that linking portion between the two.
Yeah, I think it's epoxy resin.
It could be epoxy resin. The analysis of the data will almost certainly reveal that. And if it is, well, I'll take you out for dinner. That's pretty. Yeah. My own view is that it's actually a UV curing cement, which is, of course, far more elegant than an epoxy. Never mind all that. What would really excite people in the mission itself, the scientists like Alan Stern and his colleagues, would be if a little moon could be found of Ultima Thule, or even a big moon. But at the moment, there's no sign of anything. But they'll be scanning there will be imagery of the whole region around Ultima Thule during the flyby, because if you have a moon, then you can work out what the mass is. Because you've got this, Kepler's laws and things of that sort that essentially dictate, and the laws of gravitation that dictate the way things orbit. So that is high on the agenda to keep an eye on these data. And if a moon is found, then that will be very exciting indeed, because, of course, once you've worked out the mass, then you can work out the density and probably get a better idea of what these things are made of. It's almost certainly mostly ice, as we've expected from other objects out there, including Pluto, which Pluto itself is certainly on its outer edges is composed of water ice.
And just one more thought. Now that the flyby is finished and in the next 20 months all the data downloaded, what happens to New Horizons after that? I gather they didn't think they were going to use it after the flyby of Pluto, but they found something to do with it. What are they going to do next?
The same again, I think. So Alan Stern says the spacecraft is still very healthy. It still has maneuvering fuel, and it won't get too far out of range to communicate with Earth until the mid to late 2030s.
Wow.
Alan Stern says we can do one more flyby, but also says that until now nobody's spent much time looking for a new target.
Oh, well, I'm sure they'll find plenty of rocks out there.
There's plenty of rocks out there. Yeah, the trouble is you need things like the Hubble telescope to detect these things, because, Ultima Thule, what is it, 30 kilometers across or something, and it's 6.5 billion kilometers away. Yeah. That's not much to go by.
Not at all. And it just shows how extraordinary a mission it is to be able to target something so small over such a vast distance. It's amazing. Anyway, we've got more to learn about Ultima Thule. You're listening to Space Nuts. Andrew Dunkley here with Fred Watson.
Okay, we checked all 4 systems and team with a go.
Space Nuts.
Now, Fred, we'll focus our attention on another mission that's been very successful and a little closer to home too. That's the Chang'e 4 lander, which hit the dark side of the moon not so long ago, and getting ready to do what it's supposed to do, which is very exciting.
Indeed, that's right. So you're quite right that, there's a really lovely contrast between these two stories. There's New Horizons in the absolute fringes of the solar system, and right next door to us, vying for certainly media attention, is this marvelous little Chinese lander, which touched down on the moon's far side actually on the 3rd of January. So very, very close to the time that we were looking out for images from New Horizons. In fact, on that day, I expected to be doing a lot of media on New Horizons. Didn't get any on New Horizons and spent the whole day talking about Chang'e 4, which was great.
Yes. It's always good when these things happen during the Christmas New Year break, because as a journalist, I know we're always scratching for stories.
The news, that's right.
Yeah, it's very handy when something happens.
Yeah. So what's happened? This is the 4th mission in the Chinese Chang'e series. The idea of preparing the way, I think, for Chinese taikonauts, as they're called, to perhaps walk on the moon sometime within the next decade. But Chang'e 4 carries on board a little rover. You might remember that Chang'e 3 also had on board a rover, which was called U2, U2 meaning Jade Rabbit, and the Jade Rabbit was designed to rove over the lunar surface on the near side of the moon. But actually, I think after only 40 hours, the lander itself, the rover failed to rove. It did still have all its scientific capabilities and actually made observations over a number of years of the various aspects of the moon and indeed the ultraviolet sky as seen from the moon. But it couldn't rove. So now we have something called U22 because it's number 2 in the U2 series. So
yeah,
U22,
this is going to get confusing.
Is it not? Has already been deployed very soon after the landing. We saw images of U22 rolling off its little landing platform, a couple of ramps there, towards directly facing a small crater. Just to set the scene slightly, the lander has the mission itself has targeted not just the difficult far side of the moon, because the far side of the moon, of course, is completely out of radio contact with the Earth, and the Chinese have circumvented that by this marvelous orbiting spacecraft, which is called the Magpie Bridge. It comes from a Chinese folktale. That's a relay satellite, and it's in what's called a halo orbit around one of these stable gravitational points, the Lagrange point, which is about 20,000 kilometers beyond the moon. So that is in a position where it can also always see both the Earth and the lander itself, the Chang'e lander. So that seems to be functioning perfectly. So it gets you around the problem of radio contact on the far side of the moon. As I said, not only have they chosen the difficult far side of the moon to land on, but they've also gone into perhaps one of the most interesting areas of the moon, and this is why the science that might come back from the Chang'e 4 mission is going to be very valuable. That's something called the Aitken South Pole Basin. It's a very deep depression on the moon's far side, as its name implies, near the South Pole. The terrain there is pretty rugged, and so they've faced a challenge in getting into that basin. There is a crater in there with a relatively flat bottom. It's called the von Karman crater, and that's where they've landed. So that's perhaps, it's a great idea to try and land somewhere flat, because landing in mountainous terrain when you're effectively out of radio contact directly is difficult to do. But they've done it successfully. Just to talk a little bit about the science that we might get back from this. As I explained, it's in the South Pole Aitken Basin. So that probably was formed very early in the history of the moon by a large object impacting the moon. At that time, we've talked about it before, the late heavy bombardment. There were all kinds of things charging around, and something big clouted the moon and made this depression. And the likelihood is that when it did that, it brought up to the surface some of the lower mantle rocks of the then infant moon. And so if we can sample the geology of this area, then we might find out things about the history of the moon, and certainly the early history of the moon, that we don't already know. So that's one of the really exciting aspects of this. It carries a number of instruments on board, including ground-penetrating radar. There is a German experiment on board. It's called the Lunar Lander Neutrons and Dosimetry Experiment. That's basically looking at, well, as its name implies, neutrons and the radiation that's coming from the lunar rocks and soil. Great stuff in terms of understanding more about the the history of this part of the lunar surface. So that is one component of the science. Another is very interesting to astronomers, because we think the dark side of the moon, the far side of the moon, might actually be the most radio quiet place in our bit of the solar system, because all radio signals from Earth are blocked off by the moon itself. So there is actually a set of antennas being carried on board the spacecraft, which will actually set the scene and give us ideas of what level of radio signal or radio background there is in this rather intriguing part of the moon. And the final experiment is the little biosphere, a miniature biosphere, which we've spoken about before, contains silkworms and then seeds of potatoes and cress. Which is hoped to be self-sustainable. So there'll be...
that will be really interesting to watch. I used to keep silkworms when I was growing up. I kept them for probably 3 or 4 years, and they just sort of go through their life cycle. They're intriguing creatures. But I'm really interested in how that one turns out. The first challenge for Chang'e 4 is about to happen because it's about to hit lunar night, and it gets super duper cold where they are.
Yeah, actually they're at the opposite extreme at the moment, and they've actually had the spacecraft essentially shut down to sort of protect it from the intensity of the basically the heat of the lunar day.
Okay.
I think until today, and it's the 10th of January today, I think it has been shut down to prevent any damage because the temperature's in the region of 200 degrees Celsius. But then it drops to minus 180 when you get to the lunar night, and I think they're preparing to go into this dormant state when it goes into the lunar night. So we'll hear about about how it survives that probably in about 2 weeks, because the lunar day and the lunar night last a fortnight each. Interesting stuff. It has already travelled a tenth of a kilometre as it. I beg your pardon, that is incorrect. That I'm thinking now of the original U2, which
it didn't get very far. 114 metres.
That's right. But there's certainly the U-22 has already travelled across the lunar surface. We've seen imagery of it. It's great stuff.
Yeah, and obviously more to come. You've got to hand it to the Chinese. They've really come of age as beyond Earth explorers, and it would not surprise me if they get people on the planet marching around well ahead of schedule. They just seem to have all their ducks lined up. Boom, boom. So we'll
all
watch.
their jade rabbits lined up.
All that too. We'll watch and learn more from Chang'e 4 very, very soon, I hope. You're listening to Space Nuts. Andrew Dunkley here. Fred Watson there.
0G, and I feel fine.
Space Nuts.
Finally, Fred, we're going to look into this phenomenon of alien abductions. This has been the subject of movies, documentaries, TV shows for years and years and years, with so many people claiming to have been abducted by little grey aliens. And of course we know about the Roswell incident that is now the subject of yet another TV series that starts soon. And what's happening at the moment is that the reports of alien abductions are down rather drastically, apparently, and that makes one wonder what's going on. Now, the jury's out. I tend to think that this is some sort of hysteria type of situation, but the people who claim these things have happened are incredibly convincing and obviously truly believe what happened was an alien abduction. So I don't know where we start with this one. What's your take on it? Over to you, Fred.
I'm going to start with by acknowledging the Boston Globe, who've done this investigation. One of their investigative journalists has looked at this. It's a very nice story. So there's a number of statistics that are quite surprising, I think. One is that, and this is actually a rather old poll, it's now 7 years old, done by National Geographic, but apparently 77% of Americans believe that aliens have visited the Earth, which is a colossal number.
Yes.
And 30% of Americans believe that the government has covered up evidence of alien visitation. That's a more recent poll. It's these are very, very high statistics. And then another poll in the UK showed that 1 in 25 of the respondents who came back to this poll believed they'd been abducted by aliens. That was in 2014. That's 5 years ago. So it's an incredibly popular idea that aliens have been around, that they've actually taken people away and brought them back, I think the history of that goes back to 1961, when there was something that's a very famous case within the alien abduction community of Betty and Barney Hill, who...
Yes, I've read the story.
Yes, that's right. They didn't. They thought something was following them in the car, and then found themselves 30 miles away or something, with no memory of what had actually happened. But regressive hypnosis demonstrated that they went through all kinds of interesting things, and the whole alien abduction, the whole alien abduction. Fad, I guess, is what you'd call it, grew from there. So, and of course, movies, books, the whole deal, popular things. So I think the sober voice of this story comes from people like Dr. Chris French, who's actually at Goldsmiths College in London. I love the name of the department that he heads up. It's the Anomalistic Psychology Department.
Oh, how cool is that?
Absolutely. That's
Where do you work? I work at the Anomalistic something. I couldn't remember the rest of it already.
Yeah, the Anomalistic Psychology Department. We should have one of those here. So, and a lot of studies, of course, relate these things to phenomena which go on in our brain. The facts that the number of reported abductions seems to have fallen is what they're really interested in, because that really comes about by what are the things that concern people now, and what are the things that are uppermost in our thoughts and imaginations as we conduct our day-to-day lives, and also with things like anomalistic psychology, that sort of thing. How does that play into it? So there is essentially a reduction, as you said in the headline, a reduction of these so-called abductions. And one of the reasons that's being put down for this is actually the internet. And you might think it would work the other way.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, I mean, it's just chock full of garbage. I mean, surely that would increase the numbers, but do tell. So the theory is that because of the way we communicate with each other these days, which is very different from what it was like in the 60s, when there were 3 radio stations and 2 TV stations, certainly in the UK, that's the way it was in the early 60s anyway. So everybody was watching the same stuff. Nowadays, we've got a completely fragmented media scene, and the theory is that some of these, the people who are interested in alien abductions and who believe they might have been abducted, really keep themselves to themselves. They talk to like-minded people on the internet, but you don't get these, large-scale media reports. You don't get the. So we've basically created electronic segregation.
In a way, that's right. Yes, that's absolutely right. So this is one of the reasons why this is thought to have been an effect. That there are others that some of these researchers point to. One is, the dramatic change. I mean, it was a total change in our outlook with 9/11. That 9/11 kind of brought a lot of us to our senses, in the sense that people, believing in alien abductions suddenly had something else to concentrate on, which we knew was very, very real. Maybe it focused our minds in a sort of global sense. Just a few more polls, though, that there is still a large number of people, and again, these are American statistics, 56% of Americans believed in UFOs. Now, that means unidentified flying objects, and that does not necessarily mean aliens. But the belief in UFOs is very, very prevalent, that there is something that we don't understand, whatever it is. And I think actually science takes a fairly sanguine view of this as well, that we look at UFO reports, and most of them turn out to be the planet Venus, but a lot of them turn out to be other things as well. But there seems to be a handful that defy any kind of rational explanation, and you and I have spoken about some of those before, some of these remarkable results that have come from the US military, where they've seen things moving very rapidly across the sky. We talked about pilots coming into to Southwest Island just before Christmas.
Yes, that's right.
British pilots flying Virgin jets and others.
I think I put it down to military activity.
I think at the end of the day, that's what we decided it might have been. So that, that's almost certainly where most of these things will end up. But it is interesting that a large number of people are prepared to have an open mind about UFOs.
And we have to, on the other side of the coin, there are certainly a handful of unexplained phenomena involving alien abduction cases. So, there might be a reasonable explanation, but we don't know what it is.
That's right.
But it draws me to something you and I talked about years and years ago, and that is the potential for intelligent life other than that on Earth, assuming we're intelligent. But I think you and I talked about it quite some time ago. What are the odds in terms of the development of the universe and the age of the universe and the expansion of the universe? What are the odds of an intelligent race developing and coexisting in the universe with us and being technologically advanced enough not only to find us but to visit us?
And at the same time as we're around.
Yes.
That's the crucial
exactly.
thing. Yeah. So, we have talked about this before. And, the thinking among astrobiologists is now that higher order species, and by that I mean anything other than a single-celled organism, while single-celled organisms might be relatively commonplace throughout the universe, and hopefully we'll find the answer to that soon, the transition to get from a single-celled organism up to a higher order life form, and let alone a vertebrate, but something with multi-cells, that's apparently seen as very difficult. We know it only happened once on the Earth, for example.
Yeah.
We are all directly descended from something called the last universal common ancestor. And if it's been as rare as that on Earth, where conditions are absolutely ideal for the development of life, we've got the moon stabilizing the Earth's rotation and tides kind of washing the ocean shores. All of that sort of stuff seems to be conducive to the development and evolution of life, and that some of those features could be quite rare. So people are now thinking, well, intelligent species within the universe may be so far apart, so rare, that they're never going to be able to know about each other. If we've got a species on the other side of the universe that existed 500 million years ago, we're not going to know about it.
Yeah.
And that's a fairly depressing picture.
It is, rather, and it probably suggests that we're just going to have to learn to live alone.
Well, I think it means we've got to learn to look after ourselves and guard the planet that we inhabit. Nevertheless, things like alien abductions and UFOs fill our imaginations. It gives all kinds of scope for science fiction writers such as yourself.
Oh, you had to bring that up. Yeah, look.
Yeah, it's good stuff.
Yeah, I've finished my science fiction book, and I know we had a question from a science fiction writer a month or two back who asked a question about landing an asteroid on Earth. Deliberately, yes. And I said, look, don't worry about the technicalities of it. It's science fiction. You can do whatever you like. Well, my new book, and it's my first foray into science fiction, and inspired by this podcast and talking to you over the years, Fred, so there's a few elements in the book that are drawn from things we've discussed. It will be out on the 1st of February. So it's
Very good.
It's called Parallax. I think you can pre-order the Kindle version now, but it'll start to pop up on various sites as the distribution begins to occur. But we'll talk more about that down the track. I mean,
I'm sure we will.
Don't have to talk about it now. But it was fun to write. It was not fun to do all the hard work to typeset it and get it all on on par with the distributor's requirements. That's a nightmare, to be honest. But I'm really pleased with my brother Steve, who not only designed the Space Nuts logo and our radio station's logo, DCFM here, but he designed the cover of the book, which I'm very, very happy with. A few people who've seen it already have gone, wow, that's pretty good.
I've seen it, and I think that is pretty good. I think it's great.
Yeah. So we're going to wrap it all up. We'll be back again next week with a new edition, and I think we're going to focus on questions only, because we got quite a few over the Christmas New Year period. People obviously super bored, and so we'll
what should we do? Oh, let's email Space Nuts.
And they did. So we'll tackle a few of those and see if we can come up with some answers to your questions. Fred, as always, it's been a great pleasure, and thanks for coming back this year. It's good.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I wouldn't miss it for anything. Thanks a lot, Andrew, and we'll talk again soon.
That's Astronomer at Large Fred Watson, and from me, Andrew Dunkley. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time on Space Nuts.
Space Nuts. You've been listening to the Space Nuts podcast.
Mission complete, Houston.
Subscribe to the full podcast on iTunes, Audio Boom, and Stitcher, or your favourite podcast distributor.
This has been another quality podcast production from Bytes.com.